네, 안녕하세요. 오늘 1등의 습관 네이버 특별 강연 생중계 진행을 맡은 방송인 박지훈입니다. 반갑습니다. 네. 오늘의 이 토크 콘서트는요, 굿모닝 CEO와 네이버, 웅진 싱크백이 공동으로 주최하고 있습니다. 오늘 토크 콘서트의 주제는 바로 세상을 움직이는 사람들은 지금 어떻게 일할까입니다. 정말 알고 싶은, 꼭 듣고 싶었던 주제가 아닐까 싶은데요. 오늘의 이 주제를 아주 명쾌하게 풀어주실 분이 이 자리에 계십니다. 여러분 너무나 잘 알고 계신 분이고요. 또 너무나 어렵게 모셨습니다. 세계적인 베스트셀러 습관의 힘의 저자이자 퓰리처상을 수상한 뉴욕타임스의 대표 기자이신 찰스 두이그 씨인데요. 기자이자 작가이자 또 두 아이의 아빠이자 또 남편, 맞벌이 남편으로 일했던 찰스 두이그 씨를 여러분께 소개하려고 합니다.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very
네.
much.
찰스 두이그 씨가 어느 날 인생 최대 위기를 맞는데요. 그래서 일 잘하는 사람들을 찾아 나서기 시작했는데 그 해답을 담은 책이 바로 1등의 습관이라고 해요. 이 책으로 아마존 작가, 경제 경영서, 자기계발서 2개 분야에서 모두 1위에 올랐다고 하는데요. 다시 한번 찰스 두이그 씨를 박수로 가운데로 모시겠습니다.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here this evening. I can't tell you what an honor it is to come and spend some time with you. I really appreciate everyone coming out this evening and everyone who is watching online. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here in Seoul. My name is Charles Duhigg. I'm the author of The Power of Habit and Smarter, Faster, Better, The Habits of the Most Successful People. And I wanted to come and tell you a little bit about the research that I've done this evening, because about 4 years ago, I started researching why some people were more successful than others. And for me, this was a question that I kept on asking myself, because I had just published The Power of Habit, and I was a reporter at the New York Times, and things were going very well. Professionally, I was having more success than I ever expected I would have. And I would come home at night and I would sit down with my wife and my 2 children, and I would say to my wife, if this is what success is like, then sign me back up for failure, because this is terrible. I would get home and all I would want to do is have a glass of wine and talk to my children and maybe watch bad television with my wife. But instead, I would have 100 emails to deal with, and all of these pieces of work that were left over from the day that I had to get done. And I felt like I was becoming busier and busier and busier, and despite that, I was falling farther and farther behind. And this didn't make any sense to me. So I started reaching out to researchers and asking them, why do some people seem more successful than others? Why are there some people who seem to get so much done without having to work all of the time, without having to make personal sacrifices, without not being able to spend time with their children or their family? And I will admit, when I started asking these questions, I had a hypothesis. My hypothesis was that the modern world has become so complicated that there's so much more information around us, that the most successful people were people who somehow built walls to protect themselves from Twitter and from Facebook and from all of the different types of information that are out there. But when I asked researchers, they said, this is not right. This is totally wrong. It's not that the most successful people build walls to protect themselves from knowledge. It's that the most successful people understand that they have to train themselves to think differently. In particular, the most successful people understand how their minds work, and they spend time training themselves in the right mental habits, the habits that allow them to choose the right goals, to focus, to prioritize, to self-motivate. And that if you understand how your brain works, and we're living during a time when we understand our brains so much more than ever before. If you understand how your brain works, then in fact, you can expose yourself to much more information. And you can pick and choose which bits of knowledge you should use. And so I wanted to tell you today about 3 of these insights, 3 ideas, 3 habits that the most successful people use to become more successful. And the first is innovation. Innovation is more important today than ever before. And there is a myth about innovation. And this myth is that some people were born creative and others were not. Some people are artists who sit in a room and wait for some type of brainstorm to come up with a brilliant idea. And other people are not good at creativity. And this is not right. We now know from research that anyone can become creative. The key is to understand that creativity is a process. It's not a skill. And one of my favorite ways of explaining this is the story of Frozen. Now, has anyone here seen Frozen? Anyone? Go ahead, raise your hand. Okay, a couple of people. A lot of people have seen Frozen. Has anyone, if there's one little girl here, anyone seen Frozen 100 times already? A couple of people. I have my children are 8 years old and 5 years old, so I have seen Frozen like 300 times. I know all the songs by heart. Now, here's what most people know Frozen as, this blockbuster movie. But what most people don't know is that Frozen was on the brink of catastrophe until just months before it was released in theaters. When Frozen started, the filmmakers had one idea. Their idea was that they would tell the story of an evil ice queen who lived up in the mountains, who seduced a young girl and convinced her to do evil. Well, they took this idea, they drew a couple of tests of the movie, they showed it to everyone inside Disney, and everyone said, "This is terrible. We hate this movie." So then they came up with a new idea. Instead of an evil ice queen, we'll have a young, hip ice queen. In fact, what we'll do is we'll make them both teenagers. The ice queen will be named Elsa, the young girl will be named Anna, and the ice queen will try and convince the young girl to become corrupt. Again, they spend months and months, years in fact, working on this movie. They put together a test screening, they show it to everyone inside Disney, and people hate it. It's a terrible movie. Nobody likes it. They don't like Anna and they don't like Elsa. They don't like anyone in the movie. Now, at this point, they only have about 8 months until the movie is due in theaters. Now, what's interesting about Disney is that the Disney company does not believe that some people are more creative than others, that some people have better stories. What they believe is that every movie has to fail at first. But that if you put a movie through the process of failure, if you put a movie through the Disney process of creativity, you'll find the right story. And so after this movie had already failed twice, when they were running out of time, they took everyone who was making Frozen into a room. And they said, "Listen, here's what we need to do. We need to find the story that works. What is a story that you believe in?" Well, the filmmakers sat and they thought, and they said, a story that we know really well, a story that we can tell, is a story about princesses. Because Disney knows princesses better than anyone else on earth. They know the story of Snow White and Cinderella. Disney knows how to tell princess stories. But the thing is, this story of princesses, it's a cliche. It's old. It's tired. And so the people who run Disney, they said, we need another story, another combination to put with princesses. Now, what's interesting about the filmmakers who were making Disney is that there were an unusually large number of women on the filmmaking team. In fact, the co-director of Frozen was the first female director in Disney's history. And as the filmmaking team was thinking, someone said, you know the other story that we know very well is stories about sisters, right? A lot of us have sisters. And we know that sisters, they're kind of cliched. But what's interesting about sisters is that their relationships are complicated. It's not that there's usually in real life an evil sister and a good sister and that they battle each other. It's that sisters are both equally kind of messed up. And they become friends, and then they grow apart, and then they become friends again. And so the filmmaker said, what if we did this? What if we took this idea of princesses, and we took this idea of sisters, and we combined them? They're two old stories. They're both cliches on their own. But if we combine them together, then all of a sudden there's these new creative possibilities. Because instead of having the prince save the princess at the end of the movie, we can have the sisters save each other. And then the prince can be the bad guy. He can be the villain. But we don't have to reveal that until the end of the movie. That is Frozen. It only became a movie that worked once the filmmakers started looking to their own personal experiences to find the stories that seemed true. And this is how creativity works again and again and again. Most of the things that we think of as innovations started because people looked at their own experiences as the fodder for some type of novelty, for something new. Studies show that this happens again and again and again. One of my favorite examples of this is in the 1980s, there was a company that was hired to make a new kind of helmet. And for months and months and months, they tried to invent a better helmet, and they couldn't come up with anything new. And then they hired a boat maker. He was out of work. He was looking for a temporary assignment. And they said, can you help us make a helmet? And he came in and he said, what's interesting about boats is that we build boats so that they can hit rocks, so that they can hit waves and without breaking. So what if I just made a boat that was as big as someone's head? And that's the invention of the modern day helmet, one of the greatest safety innovations of the last 30 years. We see this again and again and again. Innovation and creativity happens when people look to their own experiences, when they look to what they already know, when they draw upon their own lives as the material for new creations. Innovation doesn't explode out of nowhere. It comes from what we already have experienced. But how do we do this? How do we decide which parts of our past to draw upon? Well, to answer that, let me tell you what we know about focus. Because we've learned a huge amount about how people focus in the last 2 decades. In particular, the neurology of focus. And to talk about that, I want to tell you the story of Qantas Flight 32. In 2010, Qantas Flight 32 took off from the Singapore airport, headed to Sydney, Australia. It was an 8.5-hour flight, and it was a perfect, clear day. The takeoff was textbook perfect. About 20 minutes into the flight, when the plane's at about 12,000 feet in the air, the pilots suddenly hear this bang from the engine. And then they hear this sound like thousands of marbles being thrown against the outside of the plane. What they didn't know is that at that moment, there had been a fire in one of the engines. And this fire had caused one of the jet turbine blades, these huge, huge pieces of metal, taller than me, to detach from the shaft. And as this jet turbine blade detached from the shaft, it started shooting through the plane, and it punched a hole in the wing. This is a picture that was taken by one of the passengers out their window when this happened. This hole is big enough to put a person's body through. But this is not the bad thing that happened. Because this kind of plane, an Airbus A380, one of the most sophisticated, complicated, biggest airplanes on Earth, it can suffer a disaster like this and continue flying. The bad thing that happened is that when this fan blade detached, it hit another fan blade. And it caused that fan blade to explode into thousands of pieces. And as those pieces moved through the wing, it was like the shrapnel from a bomb. Those little pieces of fan blade, they cut through electrical lines, hydraulics lines, fuel lines. When someone saw the wing afterwards, they said it looked like someone had taken a machine gun and had raked the entire wing. Within 45 seconds, 22 of the 24 major systems that are needed to keep a plane aloft were suddenly knocked out. Inside the cockpit, alarms started exploding. When one of the pilots, the captain, reached over to adjust the throttle, he found that nothing happened because all of the controls had gone dead. Now this captain, he's kind of an interesting guy. His name is Richard de Crespigny, and he had been trained how to fly airplanes by the Australian Air Force. Now, does anyone here fly planes? Anyone a pilot? Okay, good, because I'm going to tell you a bad story. When you're trained by the military in how to fly airplanes, you're tutored in a system that's called situational awareness, or building mental models. Put differently, building mental models is learning how to tell yourself a story about what's going on as it occurs. We know a lot about building mental models and about how building mental models helps us focus from experiments that have been done with people like firefighters. The best firefighters are people who walk into a burning building, and as soon as they walk in, they start telling themselves a story about what they expect to see. They tell themselves, okay, I'm walking into the room, and I expect to see flames in that corner, and there's a staircase over there, and I think the staircase will be burning faster than everything else. And then if they walk in, and the staircase isn't burning, the story that they're telling themselves inside their head doesn't match reality, then they know, I need to focus on that staircase. Something is wrong. Or, in studies that have been done of people who work in offices, they have found that the most successful executives, the people who are best able to sharpen their attention and focus on the right things to avoid distractions, are the people who tell themselves stories about how they expect their day to unfold. Most of us think, I have a meeting at 10 o'clock and then I'm going to lunch with Jim. But the most successful executives, they say, I have a meeting at 10 o'clock, and I think Jim is going to say something first, and then Susie is going to disagree with him, and then I'm going to jump in, and I'm going to bring up my idea. They visualize their days with more specificity, and as a result, they're able to focus better on what matters. And the interesting thing about Richard de Crespigny and Qantas Flight 32 is that Richard de Crespigny was a huge fan of building mental models. In fact, in the shuttle that morning that had taken him and his co-pilots from the hotel to the airport, he had asked his colleagues to tell him stories of what they would do if there was an emergency. He would tell them, if engine 2 goes out, what are you going to do with your hands? Where's the first place that your eyes will go? What's the first thing that you'll say? And right after this emergency began, that's exactly what happened. His colleagues would turn to him, and if you listen to the recordings from the cockpit, it sounds like they're reading from a script. Everyone is calm. They speak in short sentences. And in 99% of accidents, this would have saved the day. everything would have turned out just fine. The problem with Qantas Flight 32, though, was that there were so many problems. There were so many emergencies that there was no mental model that could accommodate all of them. As soon as they would fix one problem and they would start working on that script, letting the story inside their head unfold, suddenly 5 new emergencies would pop up. And they would solve 2 of those, and then 5 more would come, or 10 more. It was all so complicated that nobody could find a mental model. Nobody could find a story that explained all of the problems this plane was having. And so Richard de Crespigny does something interesting. He's sitting at the controls. He's in one of the most complicated, sophisticated airplanes on Earth. And he takes his hands off the stick. He closes his eyes, and he thinks to himself, I need to find a new mental model. I need to find some story about this airplane that helps me keep track of what I should pay attention to and what I should ignore. Because this story is too complicated. So he decides to imagine that airplane as a Cessna. Now, has anyone here ever flown on a Cessna? A Cessna is like a toy. If you were to put an Airbus A380 and a Cessna next to each other, it wouldn't look like this. It would look like this. A Cessna is an uncomplicated plane. It has almost nothing in common with an Airbus A380. It's a ridiculous comparison to make, except that a Cessna has the 3 things that any airplane needs to fly. It has a navigation system, it has the ability to go up and down, and it has landing gear. And so de Crespigny thinks to himself, if I imagine this plane as a Cessna, it will tell me what to pay attention to and what to ignore. So by now, they've managed to turn the plane around. They're headed back to the Singapore airport. As they approach the runway, de Crespigny realizes that it's only 2,000 meters long. If he can't brake and lose speed fast enough, the plane will overshoot the runway and he'll hit the sand dunes that surround it, and the plane will likely flip over and kill everyone on board. They come and they touch down, and as they touch down, an alarm goes off in the cockpit. Now, this is an alarm that's been designed so that pilots can't ignore it. But de Crespigny turns to his co-pilots and he says, the story inside my head, the story of a Cessna, there's no alarm going off. So just ignore that alarm. They touch down. The plane is going incredibly fast, too fast to be safe. And de Crespigny has to figure out how to brake. Now, in a Cessna, when you brake a Cessna, what you do is you just punch the brakes once, and you hold the pedal down. And so that's what he did on this Airbus A380. He presses the brake pedal, and he holds it to the ground. The plane begins groaning as the metal strains against the speed. They're getting closer and closer and closer to the end of the runway. And as they approach, the plane finally slows down and stops with just 100 meters to spare. 45 minutes later, 469 people got off that plane safely. Not one person was hurt. Now the question is, why? Why was he able to do this? Because when they have tried to recreate this landing in simulators, and they've done it hundreds of times, every single time the plane crashes. And I'm not going to tell you that the reason he was able to land this plane is because he imagined it as a Cessna. Maybe he was just lucky. Maybe things just went his way. Maybe he could have made 1,000 mistakes. Because Richard de Crespigny told me this, is that the worst mistake he could have made at this moment is to stop making decisions, to simply react to all the alarms and all the emergencies around him, to become distracted by all of the warnings that are popping up on the screens in front of him. He needed a way to decide what to pay attention to and what to ignore. And what's interesting is that we know that this happens in office settings also. Think about when you go into work, right? There's hundreds of emails waiting for you. Your smartphone is buzzing in your pocket. There's colleagues who come in and they say, hey, do you have 2 minutes because I need to ask you a question? Or can you come into this meeting? We're constantly surrounded by potential distractions. This is why telling yourself a story about what you expect to unfold, trying to visualize what you actually want to get done, this is why this is powerful. Is because it gives us a way to decide, oh, I should answer that email, but I'm going to ignore the rest of them. Or when this person comes in and they ask me to come into this meeting, I'm going to say no, because it doesn't match the story inside my head. And what's most important is that when we turn to our colleagues, when we describe the narratives, the mental models that we're building, we gain control over what we focus on and what we ignore. We stop being reactive and we start making decisions. Which raises this interesting question. If so much of this is about our colleagues, if so much of this is about other people, then what do we know about teams? And this is the third insight in the habits of the most successful people, is that they think a lot about how teams function. My favorite example of this is told in the book, comes from Google. Google decided to spend 4 years and millions of dollars studying teams and trying to build the perfect team. And for years, what they thought was that the perfect team relied on putting the right people together. Maybe you need to put friends on the same team. Or maybe you need a mix of introverts and extroverts. What Google suspected is that who is on a team matters most of all. And they were totally wrong. All of their data told them that who is on a team does not matter. What matters is how a team interacts. That you can put strangers together, you can put people who don't have anything in common, you can put people who don't like each other on a team. And as long as that team has the right culture, as long as they treat each other in a specific way, then the team will gel and will succeed. And what Google found is that there's a number of behaviors that teams need in order to become successful. But the most important one is this thing known as psychological safety. The teams that are successful are teams where people feel safe enough to take risks. And so how do you create psychological safety? You create it, first of all, by creating an environment where everyone has to speak up, where everyone has to take turns expressing their opinions. And then in addition, you train people to listen, obviously, to demonstrate how they're listening, to say things like, Jim, I noticed that your arms are crossed and you haven't said anything in a while. Tell me what you're thinking about. To pick up on nonverbal cues. What's interesting is that what Google has found is that the best meetings are ones where people don't have their computers open. In fact, Google now has a rule that in a meeting you have to close your computer because we listen better to each other. We show each other that we're listening when we can make eye contact. Think about that for a moment. One of the most successful computer companies on earth requires its employees to not use their computers during meetings. But that's because what we've learned is that for a group to come together, we have to show each other that we're listening. Now, what's interesting about all these ideas, if you think about it, is that there's a common theme between innovation, between focus, between teams, which is that the behaviors which help us become successful are not the behaviors that are most efficient. It is not efficient to ask people to talk about their past, to brainstorm about what it's like with their siblings. It is not efficient during your subway ride in the morning to spend that time telling yourself a story about what you expect your day to be. It'd be much more efficient to pull out your smartphone and to check your emails or to read the latest news. It is not efficient to go into a meeting and ask everyone in that meeting to speak up. To say to someone, you're not an expert on this topic, but I want to hear what you have to say anyways. None of that is efficient. But what all of the research tells us is that that is what makes people more productive. In this current economic revolution that we're living through, there is a war going on between efficiency and productivity. All of us are incredibly busy. We spend every day being busy. When I would come home and I would have 150 emails that I needed to deal with, I would feel busy. But busyness is the enemy of productivity. Busyness is the enemy of success. When we're busy, we're not thinking about what we ought to be doing. We're simply reacting to other people's demands, or we're reacting to what society asks us to do. Throughout history, the key to success has been forcing ourselves to think more deeply. The most successful people have habits that force them to think. It forces them to visualize their days. It forces them to think about their experiences. It forces them to get to know their teammates, to learn who they really are. And those things are not efficient, but they are the things that make us successful. And hopefully you'll be able to take some of this and become more successful and more productive in your own lives. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time.
네. 미국에서도 물론 그러시겠지만 한국에서 혹시 인기를 좀 실감하신 적이 있나요? 네. 누가 알아본 적이 있나요? 오, 찰스 이러면서.
Once or twice, but my wife tells me that I'm not that popular. She does not want me to get a big ego, so she says, nobody knows who you are.
You
they
are
think
not
you're someone
movie
else.
star. 예. 네. 이번이 한국의 두 번째 방문이시라고 들었어요. 한국에 대한 인상이 어떠신지 또 한국에 계신 저자분들은 궁금해하실 것 같아요. 네.
I love Korea. Seoul and Korea is one of the most fascinating, one of my favorite cities on earth. And one of the reasons why I'm so interested in Korea is because it's a nation that has completely transformed itself in such a few number of years. It is a model of how a culture becomes successful and productive, and also the challenges that come from being driven and being focused on goals. I know that one of the things that people talk to me about in Seoul is that it's a double-edged sword. That there are so many positives from being focused on success, but also that it can make your life harder. And I think for that reason, it's a fascinating case study.
네. 양날의 검이라는 부분에서 많은 분들이 공감을 하시면서 또 고개를 끄덕여 주셨어요. 많은 분들이 또 궁금해하시는 게 얼마나 바쁘시길래 네, 이런 책을 쓰셨을까? 책 제목이 Smarter, Faster, Better이에요. 일단 너무 바쁘시니까 그런 생각도 하시게 된 것 같아요. 가장 바빴던 하루 일과를 혹시 나눠 주실 수 있을까요?
The most busiest day.
Yes.
The most busiest day was the day that my second son was born. I was so tired that I fell asleep while my wife was in labor because we were trying to buy an apartment on the same day, and then she suddenly went into labor, and she was not happy.
Yeah.
I had to rush to the hospital, and then I started falling asleep, and she told me that was a bad bad idea.
네, 그 마음은 충분히 이해를 합니다. I understand her. 예. 그러면 그렇게 바쁜 일상 중에서도 뭐 많은 뭐 독자분들에게 알려드리고 싶은 욕구도 있었겠지만 스스로의 어떤 문제를 해결하기 위해 이 책을 쓰신 게 아닌가라는 생각이 들어요. 언제 나는 이 책을 써야겠다, 1등 습관을 알아야겠다라고 생각을 하셨나요?
Well, that's exactly why I wrote it. Is that I felt like the more successful I became, the more miserable I was. The whole point of success is that you're supposed to be able to enjoy it. But I would get more and more successful, and all I had was more and more work. And I knew people who it seemed like had some secret that they managed to be successful at work, but also not be stressed, to spend time with their kids. And I wanted to figure out what was their secret. And so that's why I wrote the book.
네, 마법이다. 네, 그 마법이란 단어 안에서 뭔가 그 더 큰 힘이 느껴지는 것 같아요. 사실 그 마법을 사용하고 계신 분들에게는 아주 단순한 것일 수도 있겠지만요. 자, 1등의 습관을 쓰시면서 세상에서 일을 잘한다는 그 마법을 가지고 계신 분들을 400여 분 넘게 만나셨습니다. 네, 사실 이 책의 장점은 놀라운 취재력이 아닐까 싶은데요. 어떻게 이 많은 사람들을 다 찾았을까, 여러분 궁금하지 않으세요?
Just by making phone call after phone call.
Phone call.
It takes a long time. But this is actually one of the lessons that the book taught me, is that if I wanted to write this book quickly, what I would do is I would have talked to 20 people. And as soon as I talked to someone, I would just write down their story. But that wasn't the best story. I had to find the right stories. I had to find the stories that were most interesting or most insightful or most exciting. And that takes time. It can feel very, very inefficient. But sometimes you have to say to yourself, in the short term, this can seem wasteful, but in the long term, this is what success is. And I'm going to invest in taking the time I need to think as deeply as I can.
네. 그러니까 시간을 잘 활용하는 비법이 담긴 책이지만 결국에는 많은 시간을 들여서 이 책을 만들었다는 사실을 우리가 알 수 있었어요. 이건 제가 개인적으로 궁금한 건데요. 혹시 그 비밀을 나눠주길 거부하셨던 취재원도 있는지 그게 궁금해요. 네.
Yes.
네. 그분의 이름은 물어보지 않겠습니다. 예.
But I would harass them over and over and over, and then eventually they would tell me.
네, 역시 그 미국에서도 통하네요. 지성이면 감천이다, 그런 게요. 네.
Try.
Yeah, try. 네.
I think my 8-year-old son, he knows the same lesson. Just ask and ask and ask. And eventually I say, okay.
네. 그들만의 시크릿이죠. 네. 자, 인터뷰하신 분들 가운데는요, 미국 해병대 4성 장군도 있었고요, FBI도 있었고, 디즈니 관계자, 네, 겨울왕국을 만드셨던, 그리고 뭐 픽사의 창업자도 있었고, 많은 분들을 만나셨는데 이분들 가운데 공통점을 어떻게 좀 느끼셨는지 모르겠어요. 네.
There was a common feature. The most successful people, whether they're in the military or what the FBI or movie makers or just business people, they spend a lot more time thinking about how they define success. So it's very easy to stop asking ourselves, what do I think success is? It's very easy to say, I'm going to define success by what my boss says, or my friends say, or magazines, or newspapers, or society. But people who are very successful, they keep forcing themselves to say, what is success? And it changes from time to time. A successful Wednesday morning might mean that you get your kids to school and you rush to the office and you get through all of your emails. But a successful Friday morning might mean that you walk your children to school and you're relaxed and you can ask them questions and you can spend time where you don't feel rushed. People who are successful, they force themselves to think about this, to ask this question. What is my goal for today? What is my goal for this week? What is my goal for this month? Instead of just reacting, they build a mental model about what success is for them. And then they constantly ask themselves, is this the right mental model? Should I think about an Airbus A380 or should I think about a Cessna?
네. 그러니까 저희 7살 된 딸아이가 제일 많이 하는 말이 있어요. 너는 어떻게 생각해? 라고 하면 생각 이렇게 해요. 말버릇일 수도 있겠지만 그런 호흡이 우리 일상에도 좀 필요하지 않나? 그냥 단순히 진도를 나간다거나 또 업무량을 그냥 해내기 바쁘게 살아왔던 것 같은데 그런 순간이 분명히 필요하다는 사실을 그분들의 공통점을 통해서 얘기를 전해주신 것 같습니다. 네. 자, 늦게까지 야근을 하고 더운 날씨에 땀도 흘리시고 분명 열심히 살고 계세요. 하지만 가장 중요한 게 smarter라는 단서도 붙고요. faster라는 단서도 붙은 것 같아요. 그러면은 그렇게 빨리 현명하게 일을 해내면서도 완벽한 결과를 만들어내고 싶을 거예요. 가장 중요한 게 뭘지 어떻게 보면 이게 우문이 될 수도 있지만 다시 한번 여쭤보고 싶네요.
No, it's a great question. So one of the things to realize is that perfect results is oftentimes the enemy of being smarter and faster and better. If we just chase perfection, we never learn from our missteps. People who are very successful, they tend not to see their decisions as good or bad. Instead, they see their choices as experiments. And is anyone here a scientist? My wife is a scientist. She's a marine biologist. And one of the things about being a scientist is that when you do an experiment, you want it to fail. If the experiment does exactly what you expect, then it doesn't work. You didn't learn anything new. So you take an experiment and you push it farther and farther and farther until it fails. And then you learned something. If we think about our own choices as experiments, if we allow ourselves to fail and we say, that's okay, that was the whole point, then we learn so much more. And we also forgive ourselves. We take the pressure off to be perfect. Nobody who has done anything important was perfect. The only reason that Steve Jobs was able to create the iPhone or that Thomas Edison was able to create the light bulb or that nations have succeeded is because people said, I'm going to fail again and again and again. I don't even know if I'll ever become perfect. Instead, I'll just try until it gets better and better and better.
네. 아무래도 스스로에게 가장 많이 하시는 질문이 이거 아니세요? 나는 잘하고 있는 걸까? 네, 이제부터는 내가 잘못한 게 뭘까? 그 안에서 해답을 한번 찾아봐야겠다라는 생각이 듭니다. 네. 자, 좋은 방법론 중에 하나로 책에 투두 리스트라는 게 나왔어요. 할 일 목록이죠. 네. 할 일 목록을 잘 작성하는 방법을 말씀해 주셨는데 일 잘하는 사람들은 이 목록을 작성하는 것에서 그치지 않고 잘 활용을 할 것 같아요. 뭐 스마트폰 어플리케이션에 뭐 기록을 한다거나 메모장을 쓰는 습관도 괜찮은가요?
So how many people in this room write to-do lists on a regular basis? A lot of us, right? I used to write a to-do list this way. I would use it as an external memory aid. I would write down just a list of tasks. And sometimes at the top of the list, I would put the easiest things that I wanted to get done. In fact, sometimes, and about 15% of people do this, I would write down something I had already done because it felt so good to sit at my desk and cross it off right away. Yeah, you do this also? If you think about it, if you write a to-do list and it just has a list of chores or a list of tasks, your brain will always look for the easiest thing to do. Because your brain loves feeling that sense of accomplishment. So when successful people write to-do lists, they write them a little bit differently. Instead of just using a to-do list as a memory aid, they use it as a system to force them to think about their priorities. And the way that they do that is at the top of the list, they write what's known as a stretch goal. Their biggest goal for today, for this week, for this month, for this year. And then that way, every time they look at that list, they are reminded, here is the most important thing for today. If you are returning emails and you look at your to-do list and your stretch goal has nothing to do with returning emails, then you know I'm wasting time on the wrong thing. I ought to be prioritizing something else. We should use our to-do lists to remind ourselves to think about not just what should I do next, but what is most important. That's how successful people write to-do lists differently. They use their to-do list to challenge themselves to think about what their biggest priority ought to be.
네, 고맙다는 얘기를 해드리고 싶네요. 저의 오늘 꼭 해야 할 일을 상기시켜 주셨어요. 네, you remind my stretch goal. Yes, thank you. 예. 근데 한국에서는 두 마리 토끼를 잡는다고 하죠. One rabbit is homework, successful at home. 네, 그리고 다른 토끼는 직장에서 비즈니스 토끼가 있죠. 네. 자, 이 두 마리를 다 잡기가 힘들다고 하는데 어떻게 해야 이 양쪽에서 다 칭찬을 들을 수 있을지 모든 맞벌이 하시는 아빠들 그리고 취업 준비생분들 그리고 워킹맘들이 겪고 있는 고민이 아닐까 싶어요. 네.
So how many people in this room or watching feel like you work too much? Me too. It's very easy to work all the time. And the reason why is because our brain loves feeling that sense of fast accomplishment. Our brains have evolved to crave distractions. A millennia ago, if you had the ability to multitask, you had a huge advantage. Because if you could plant crops and look for predators at the same time, you had a huge advantage over someone who could just plant crops or just look for predators. And so our brains evolved to crave distractions. So when we're sitting at the dinner table with our kids and our phone buzzes in our pocket, we want to reach in and grab our phone and look at what the new email is. Or when we want to leave the office to get home to see our kids, and someone comes in and they say, "Oh, no, I just learned something, let me tell you." Our brain wants to learn this new fact. It wants to be distracted. So the key is to know that we have this craving for distraction and to try and protect ourselves from it. Sometimes that means when you're at home with your children, turning off your smartphone or taking your phone out of your pocket. Or sometimes it means coming up with rules for yourself. At 5:30, I have to leave. It doesn't matter what's going on. But it's also about making choices. Instead of just reacting, it's about deciding what your priorities are. When we say that we struggle with work-life balance, what it means is that we're not making a choice about work and life. And the more that we push ourselves to make that choice, that's when we learn how to have the balance.
네. 선택이 아니라는 말이 좀 위로가 되지 않으세요? 때로는 좀 매정해 보일 수도 있지만 가정에서 볼 때 매정해 보이고 사회에서 볼 때 매정해 보일 수 있지만 나만의 룰을 좀 지켜가는 것도 중요하겠다라는 생각이 들어요. 근데 이제 팀워크 얘기가 나왔습니다. 네, 일 잘하는 사람들이 모여야 잘 되는 거 아니야? 우리 팀은 너무 인적 구성이 안 좋아라는 고민도 많이 해보셨을 텐데요. 만약에 팀의 리더가 나랑 맞지 않는다면 내가 떠나는 게 맞을까요? 아니면 거기서 뭔가 바꿀 수 있는 방법이 있을까요? 네.
Not necessarily. And this gets to this issue that you brought up of control, of feeling like we have control over our life. I've been on teams with people who I found to be incredibly annoying. And here's what I found, is that if I feel like someone is annoying, and then I start to get to know them a little bit more, I ask them about their lives, I ask them about their children, I learn about their hobbies. Magically, they become less annoying. They improve a lot. But I don't think it's that they change. I think it's that I change. Oftentimes, when we're on a team where we have tensions, it's because we don't have this psychological safety. We feel like we don't have control. And one of the things that we know from experiments is that the way that we generate motivation, the way that we generate enthusiasm, is by finding opportunities to exert control. So the more that we can take a chore and turn it into a decision, the more that we trigger those parts of our brain where motivation resides. And this is very powerful, because if I'm on a team and I feel like someone keeps on ignoring me, or they keep talking over me, or they don't listen to my suggestions, if I find a way to exert more control, I'll be less frustrated. I'll be more motivated. But if I do that the wrong way, if I just bulldoze that person, then they get frustrated. They don't feel in control. And so what studies tell us is that the way that we allow everyone to feel control is that we encourage them to learn about each other. That when I was in college, I had this one roommate who drove me crazy. He would play his music all the time, and he was like, he would talk incessantly. He never stopped talking. And what was magical is that once I got to know him, I didn't mind him talking. And once I understood why he liked this music, and he let me start playing my music, I thought it was okay that he plays music all the time. This is how we learn to share control, is by actually speaking to each other and listening to each other. And he's actually one of my best friends now. But it's only because we invested time in learning who each other was that we both felt like we could speak up and that we could listen to each other. That's when we learned to share control. That's when motivation really flourishes.
네, 그 결혼 생활에 적용해도 되게 좋을 것 같지 않으세요? 네, 많은 분들이 고개를 끄덕이시네요. 남편을 더 이해하고 다가가려는 노력, 하지만 통제권을 잃지 않으려는 노력. 네, 해보겠습니다. 네. 겨울왕국이요. 저도 아이 엄마기 때문에 진짜 한 300번 이상, 네, 한 1000번은 본 것 같아요. 노래도 그렇고요. 근데 이게 재미없는 스토리였다라는 정말 그 나쁜 여왕에 관한 이야기를 듣고 깜짝 놀랐어요. 네. 근데 정말 그렇게 많은 사람들이 머리를 맞대고 좋은 팀워크를 가지다 보니까 또 그런 졸작이 명작이 되기도 하네요. 네.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But what's interesting is that if you ask the team that made Frozen, what they'll tell you is that they were very tense the entire time. And here's the thing about creativity, is that oftentimes when we have to be creative and we feel like there are mistakes, we feel tense, we see that as a symptom of a problem. But studies show that's not true. Most of the creative breakthroughs come from a sense of tension, a sense of worry. Psychologists call this creative desperation. And what's interesting is that people who are practiced at creativity, they know that when they feel panic, when they feel uptight, that's a good sign. That's a sign that everything is working right. Peter Del Vecchio, the producer of Frozen, told me that he was convinced that Frozen would be a flop until 2 days before it came out in theaters. He thought it would be the biggest flop of his career. It was only when he was sitting amongst an audience who had never seen the film before, strangers who had been brought in to see the opening night feature, and they started laughing and they clapped at the end of the film. That was the first time he realized that the film was good and that people might want to see it. So when we feel tense, when we feel uncertain, that's not a symptom of things going wrong. That's proof that things are working.
네, 저 여기 올 때 되게 긴장했는데 오늘 잘 된 것 같아요. 토크 콘서트가 갑자기 마음이 편해지네요. 네. 한국이 경제 상황이 안 좋고 취업을 준비하시는 분들도 굉장히 많이 힘들어하세요. 미래에 대한 두려움을 가진 분들에게 네, 힘내라고 네, 좋은 메시지를 전해주신다면 어떨까요?
So it is. We are living right now through an economic revolution that is as profound as the Industrial Revolution. Right? 50 years from now, people will look back on this time and they will say that the world changed. Not overnight. It takes decades, but the world is changing right now. And in retrospect, that seems exciting and it seems romantic. But when you're living through it, it's incredibly anxiety-producing. It feels very worrisome. But the thing that we know is that the people who succeed are the people who engage with that anxiety, who push themselves to think more, who try and learn by coming to lectures or by reading books or by watching television programs or by having hard conversations with their spouses and their friends. The people who push themselves more, they're the ones who learn how to succeed in this new world. And for our children, it'll be a completely different place. The information revolution will already be established, and they'll know what jobs to have, and they'll know how to succeed. But for us, we are living through the transition. And the only thing that we can do is we can say, I understand it's hard. It's not my fault, but I will succeed because I'm committed to learning how to think better by taking advantage of all the knowledge around me.
네, 정말 우리가 잘못한 거는 하나도 없을지도 몰라요. 네, 그 안에서 우리가 잔잔한 위로를 얻을 수 있고 하루를 살아갈 수 있는 힘을 얻을 수 있을 것 같은데요. 그런 의미에서 이런 성공의 작은 비밀의 열쇠라도 많이 나눠주셨으면 좋겠는데 앞으로의 계획도 궁금합니다. 또 다음 책이 어떤 책이 될지 기대감도 있으실 것 같고요.
It's a good question. I don't know. I'm working on it right now. It's one of the things that I decided after this book is to take my own advice and to take as much time as I need to find the next book topic. So I fly back to the United States tomorrow, and I intend to spend just a few weeks with my family and with my kids, and most importantly, just thinking about what I should do next. Instead of rushing into a new project, instead of giving in to that craving to feel busy, I'm going to be as slow as I can and try and make the right decision rather than the fast decision.
네. 오늘 이 시간 많은 그 독자분들이 한 300여 분 이상 함께 해주셨고요. 또 생중계로 함께 하신 분들도 조금 이 시대를 살아갈 만한 힘을 얻지 않으셨을까 하는 생각이 들고 저도 또한 많은 에너지를 얻습니다. 여기서 다 못 나눈 이야기는요. 잠시 후에 또 여러분 사인회도 있고 하니까 그때 에너지를 얻어가셨으면 좋겠고요. 소중한 메시지 전해주신 찰스 두이그 씨에게 다시 한번 큰 박수 전해주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And
네.
thank you.